Hi, it's Mr. Zenario, and welcome to our first flipped lesson for 12th grade world history. Today's lesson has to do with World War I and World War II. Here are our objectives. As a class, this flipped lesson should give you information based on World War I and World War II. You will be able to assess the following aspects of the respective wars. First, we have reason. So, for example, in World War I, we'll go over that there was an assassination of a certain somebody who kind of sparked the war. And then for World War II, there was a corrupt leader, which I'm sure at this point many of you guys do know about. Next up, we have war tactics. For war tactics, we will explain the use of, for example, poison gas, airplanes being brought into war, submarines, stuff like that. Next up is fatality. Fatality is the number killed during the war. So for World War I, we'll have an X number of people that were killed, including civilians. And in World War II, we will have a number X killed, including civilians. Lastly, we have innovation. Innovation is basically what the war brought to the table at the time. So, example, for World War II, they used airplanes, they used submarines, they used encryption, stuff like that, that innovated the way war was thought of. And for World War I, we have things like poison gas, we have things like the bringing up of machine guns, etc., etc. We will begin with World War I. World War I began in 1914 and lasted until 1918, so a total of about 4 years. What was the cause, though? That's something you may be thinking of, and I did say something earlier in the flip lesson that had to do with the assassination of somebody, and here it is. Right here we have the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand. He was assassinated, and basically what happened was a huge game of finger pointing. So there was countries, Austria was pointing fingers at this country, they were pointing fingers at another country, and then eventually what happened was they all took a side, and then war honestly just began right then and there. So who took what side? The Central Powers included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, among other smaller countries. And then you have the Allied Powers, which included France, Britain, Russia, Italy, Japan, and from 1917 onward, the United States. Now let's talk about war tactics used in World War I. So, World War I was a very innovative war. Prior, there was no war fought quite like it. It introduced things such as machine guns. Prior to World War I, machine guns hadn't really heavily been used in war. If you think about it, the biggest major war before World War I was the Neapolitan Wars. And they were still riding horses. They were still using muskets and bayonets. Next up, we have artillery. Artillery isn't really a new war tactic, but it was used a little bit better, which is why I'm including it in the war tactics section for World War I. Next up, we have tanks. This is the first war in which tanks were used. It wasn't as heavily used as World War II because they didn't have the extreme technology they had at the time, just 20 years later, but they did begin using them then. Next up, we have airplanes. World War I, again, just like I said with tanks, airplanes were used, but they weren't heavily used like they were in World War II. Next, we have poison gas. Poison gas was used heavily in World War I as a tactic to get the enemy out of the bunker. This poison gas was so strong that after World War I, they actually banned it from warfare. It was that lethal of an option. Next, we will talk about the fatality in World War I. For military dead, there was an approximation at 10 million. For civilian dead, there was an approximation at 7 million. For missing and imprisoned, there's 7.7 million people that were missing after World War I or imprisoned. And then for wounded, there's a whopping 21 million people wounded. That is just crazy. Lastly, we will round up the overall innovation of World War I. So, as I said earlier, World War I brought many new things to the war, such as tear gas or poison gas, the use of airplanes, all of the things that I said prior in this video had never been used in war. For example, like I said earlier, in the Neapolitan Wars, about 100 years earlier, the last major war prior to World War I, horses, muskets, bayonets, communication was barely used because they didn't have things that they could just immediately, send to each other. They had to use horses to get it to the person they wanted to send it to. So World War I brought huge innovation to the aspect of war. So now we will begin with World War II. World War II was fought from the years of 1939 to 1945, so it lasted around 6 years, 2 years longer than World War I, and as we will see later on in the presentation, the death totals do add up. So who started World War II? Well, I'm sure a lot of you guys do understand a little bit of how World War II started, but it really began through this guy right here, Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was the dictator of Germany. Now, after World War I, Germany had huge sanctions brought against itself through the Treaty of Versailles. They had war taxes, they had restrictions, they had war restrictions. They couldn't do everything that other countries could do because they caused so much damage during World War I that it just had to be stopped. Hitler had other plans in mind, and he took power to Germany and defied all of the laws that were put against Germany. This, respectively, began World War II, because nobody could just sit there and let Germany run over everybody and not take all of these sanctions put against themselves that were justified sanctions. In World War II, there were two sides known as the Axis and the Allied powers. As you can see through the pictures, there was Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy for the Axis powers, and for the Allied powers, we had the United States of America, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. China was also an Allied power, but they didn't play a huge role in World War II, so in this picture they were not included, but I figured that I would list them here just because. Next up, we have the war tactics for World War II. Just like in World War I, World War II brought immense innovation. The things that were brought into play during World War II include nuclear warfare. As a lot of us do know, or we will soon know in this class, there was a nuclear bomb or an atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States during World War II. So that was introduced. We also have missiles. Missiles played a huge role in World War II. We have encryption. Encryption played a huge role. It was always used. Encryption's been used for centuries and centuries, probably longer than that. But it was mainly used in World War II to keep messages from getting taken from the enemy. So, for example, Germany, if they needed to get a message across a couple of countries, they would make sure that they encrypted the message so that if it did get stolen, it wouldn't get deciphered. And we also have submarines. Submarines played a huge role in World War II because they played a hand in which they couldn't see you, but you were headed towards them. Submarines were very lethal in World War II. Next up, we'll talk about the fatality. World War II was a very gruesome war, as its estimation of death comes to 80 million lives. 38 to 50 million were killed as civilians, and 13 to 20 were killed post-war from disease or famine. So, for example, if the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and you lived there, and you didn't die immediately and you died a couple years later due to radiation poisoning, then that's one of those deaths. It's quite sad how many people actually did die during World War II. So lastly, we'll talk about the overall innovation. World War II innovated ways that were strategic, encryptions, nuclear power, mass use of tanks and submarines, etc., etc. World War II made war go way up on the scale of seriousness, as it's super deadly now, especially with the nuclear power that almost every country can hold. And especially at the time, it was a huge innovation. All right, so that concludes our flipped lesson, but I'm not done yet. Tomorrow, we're going to have a debate. During the debate, you're going to be split into two. You're either going to be World War I or you're going to be World War II. So for tomorrow, I want you guys to make sure that you have your information on what war was the most innovative. You're going to have reasons for both sides, because you're not going to know which side you're going to be on for tomorrow's debate. So make sure you have your list for innovations of World War I, and make sure you have your list for innovations of World War II, and reasons why either one of them could be the most innovative war. All right, I'll see you guys in class tomorrow.